State meeting this morning with a request for bill introductions. Are there any from the committee or the audience? Seeing none, very good. We also sent out minutes for February 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, and 20th for your review. And committee, if we have a motion on those minutes, if you've had time to look at that. Senator Holscher.
So move.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the minutes and a second by Senator Straub. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The minutes are approved. Okay, we're going to open the hearing on SCR 1609, and we'll start with a bill brief from Jason, our revisor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Concurrent Resolution 1609 is a resolution making application to the United States Congress to call a convention of the states for the purpose of proposing amendment to the U.S. Constitution to establish term limits for members of Congress. You have seen similar resolutions in the past. An Article 5 convention is one that is called by Congress when sufficient states, 2/3 of the states, have applied to Congress to call such a convention for a particular purpose. And then that convention would propose amendments, which then must be ratified by 3/4 of the states to become effective. 1609 has a very limited purpose in terms of just amendments to establish term limits for members of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Pursuant to the Constitution of the state of Kansas, this resolution must be approved by 2/3 majority vote of both the Senate and House of Representatives to become effective and to go to Congress as an official application. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, sir. We've got just one proponent oral testimony and two opponents, so I think I'm going to give 10 minutes to each side to state their case and open for questions after each of the sides. So up first, we have via WebEx, Shanna Chambly, Regional Director, U.S. Term Limits, and Shanna's on WebEx. Shanna, can you hear us?
I can, Mr. Chairman.
All righty, Shannon, we'll give you a total of 10 minutes. Thank you, and clock starts now.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm sure that I'm not going to need 10 minutes for this, but I will gladly take questions. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee this morning. I'm obviously here advocating for SCR 1609 for the Single Topic Amendment Convention to propose term limits on U.S. Congress. And I'm a regional director for the organization U.S. Term Limits. First, I believe it's crucial to highlight the groundswell of public support for this issue. A recent study conducted by the Pew Research Center revealed that an overwhelming 87% of American voters want term limits on U.S. Congress. It's the highest polling nonpartisan issue that there is in the country. I believe that this underscores the urgency and importance for addressing this matter. With our specific resolution, there have currently been 6 states that have passed. That's Florida, Alabama, Missouri, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma. We've had about 5 or 6 other states that have passed one chamber, but not the other. Some of those pending for final passage this year as a rollover. I believe that that signals a growing movement among states to call for a convention focused solely on this purpose. Last session, we passed the Kansas House by a simple majority vote, but did not meet the requirement of the Kansas Constitution for a 2/3 majority. We have been diligently working to gain those votes there, and I believe that we can pass the Senate chamber with the votes needed, and the Senate chamber will answer to the will of the people by passing this with a supermajority vote. That is my hope. I would like to highlight the fact that while these state level efforts are gaining traction, it's noteworthy to consider that the expected response from Congress History has shown via other convention efforts that they will preempt this effort. I do not personally believe, nor does our organization believe, that this will actually lead to a convention. Not that I have any worries about a convention, but historically, Congress has preempted convention efforts such as the Bill of Rights, women's suffrage, the repeal of prohibition, and presidential term limits. As states pass resolutions for Article 5 conventions and the momentum builds, Congress eventually preempts these calls. And I believe with all of my heart that they will preempt this call because they do not want the states to come together to determine their own term limits. But this is the pressure button to gain action from our Congress. The popularity of term limits, as demonstrated by the Pew Research study and increasing number of states that support this resolution, underscores the urgency for Congress to heed the will of the people. It's a clear signal that voters across party lines want a more dynamic, accountable, and responsible federal legislature. In conclusion, the U.S. term limits Article 5 resolution is a reflection of the collective voice of the American people. With the support of 87% of voters and backing from multiple states, we anticipate that more states join this movement. Congress will recognize the inevitability of this change and proactively propose term limits on themselves. This is a historic opportunity for you to align the will of the people with the actions of our government. And I thank you for having this hearing today. I'm open to answer any questions pertaining to the process or the resolution itself.
Thank you, Shanna. Shanna is our only proponent on this particular resolution committee. Are there any questions for Shanna? I don't see any. Shanna, I will ask just one.
Okay.
Do you know the longest running U.S. senator and how long they've been there? Just curious.
Oh, goodness, you put me on the spot there. I can name several who have been very long serving, but the longest one, you've got me there, put me on the spot of.
I don't know the answer. I was just seeing if you happen to have, I'd take the top 2 or 3 just out of curiosity.
Oh, well, I guess in Congress, we had Don Young from Alaska, who was just a few months shy of 50 years before his passing. I personally live in Alabama, and I had Senator Richard Shelby as my senator all of my adult life for 38 years. And that's ones I can name off the top of my head at the moment.
Okay. Senator Straub does have a question.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I Googled it here. It says Robert C. Byrd, a Democrat from West Virginia, served from 1959 until 2010, 51 years, 5 months, and 26 days.
Oh, wow.
Long time. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Shanna. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Next, we'll turn to our opponent oral testimony. We have 2 people, and I'll give, again, 10 minutes total. First, John Axtell, a volunteer coordinator, Kansas Campaign for Liberty. And just be aware, John, you'll have somebody behind you. So at the end of the 10 minutes, we'll open up for questions from the committee.
Okay,
and we'll start the clock right now, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Honorable Chairman Thompson and members of the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee, I oppose this resolution. First, because a term limits amendment will not clean up Washington. The problem in Washington is the establishment. The people that have been around a very long time are the tip of the iceberg, but the iceberg is the establishment itself. As soon as a person that's been around a long time leaves office under whatever circumstances, the establishment, their donors, the lobbyists, even the office staff, people who have become powerful under that person's tenure, those people will work to restore their power through the new person coming in just as quickly as they can. And we've all seen how this works. How many times have you seen a charming young candidate promise, I will never, ever vote for an unbalanced budget? And the first trip back from Washington, they're going, oh, I'm sorry, I had to vote for the unbalanced budget. And it was only $1 trillion, but it would have been worse if it was the other guy that had been there instead of me, right? We've seen that. And we know how that happens because the establishment is coming in and taking over that space immediately with the new person, just like they did with the old person that's been around too long. So the solution to that problem is simply stated, but it's difficult, and it's to establish powerful grassroots movements that are as powerful as the establishment and that can hold those elected officials responsible. Now, that's a very difficult job, but it's simple, and it's what must be done. Another objection to the term limits amendment is the presumption that when we send delegates to such a convention, we can somehow constrain them. That's not the case. The truth is to be found in the story behind the lawsuit against the state of Kansas, against the Kansas Constitution, where the precedent for that lawsuit, the idea behind that lawsuit, as cited in the 2019 letter from the then Attorney General, is the 1975 Dyer versus Blair case. And in that case, the court has said that the Illinois constitutional provision may only be precatory in its effect on the federal process, and the legislative houses are free to accept or reject the 3/5 supermajority requirement. So they had a similar situation to us here in Kansas. They had voted for a constitutional amendment where we had voted for a convention under Article 5. But the court said that when participating in the federal process, I want to be clear, when participating in the federal process, the state legislature could, quote, accept or reject the provisions of the state constitution. So it's the fact of participating in the federal process that brings this question up. But if the state can accept or reject the provisions of the state, or excuse me, if the state legislature can accept or reject the provisions of the state when participating in the federal process by calling for a convention, so can the delegates reject the provisions of the state or accept them when acting as delegates in this federal process. You see, it's the federal process, it's participation in the federal process that causes you to be separated from the jurisdiction or authority of the state. And it causes that state authority to only be precatory, only a suggestion to the state legislature in the case of the lawsuit, or to the delegates in the case of the convention. The second issue I want to bring up about this issue, about this lawsuit, is that the court said the state legislature may accept the Constitution of the state. It didn't declare that unconstitutional. In fact, it said it may accept it, and therefore, had the court ruled on that issue, it's certain that it would have said it is constitutional. That's a point that needs to be cleared up because I've seen it represented otherwise. I've seen it represented that the Kansas Constitution is unconstitutional with respect to the federal one, and that's the reason for having this adjudicated in federal court. The case, the federal court has already said the state legislature may accept or reject the state constitution. So those are two really important points about the whole process. And if we do send people to a constitutional convention for term limits, we should keep in mind that the delegates cannot be constrained. The federal courts have already decided that. So I urge you to vote against this resolution. I thank you for your consideration of my testimony, and I'll be glad to stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We hit it almost right at the halfway point. We've got Sean Meehan from the founder of the Guard of the Constitution. Sean is via WebEx, and Sean, you've got about 4 minutes left before we open up to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you and your committee again. I want to thank Mr. Axtell for his testimony, and I think that's very important. The founders of our Constitution already considered the analysis of term limits. They were in effect in the Articles of Confederation, and when they wrote our Constitution, they chose to remove them because they literally are giving an aspirin to a cancer patient. They don't fix the problem. And let me illustrate why. My current state of Nevada in 2014, 78% of our voters in November 2014 disapproved a proposed commerce tax. The very next January, our legislature came to order. We meet 4 months every 2 years. First Republican majority in 30 years. We are term limited on our state legislators. After that 78% vote of the people, they've still voted to institute themselves a similar tax. Term limits don't work. To elaborate on what your introductory gentleman said about a limited purpose, I want to add to what Mr. Axtell said, that I would ask the members of the committee to consult House Concurrent Resolution 24 in the U.S. Congress right now, the Judiciary Committee. It is from Congressman Arrington from the Abilene, Texas area, and it purports to call an unlimited topic convention where Congress exercises its authority to incorporate all outstanding Article 5 petitions without regard to subject. I was told it would disappear and die in a drawer. It has actually had a hearing in the judiciary presided over by the now Speaker of the House. This is something that's being pushed. The sponsor talked about a groundswell. The sponsor's talking about a democracy or a mobocracy. Legislators represent us in a republic. And while we want to listen to the voters' intent, your job is to educate us and act where we may be ignorant and not listen to our mobocracy groundswells. And this is the case where the public doesn't understand. They talked about a bluff. She actually used the phrase, this is a pressure button. As a retired combat zone veteran, and remembering the death of all the veterans in the history of this country that died for our Constitution, I'd really respectfully like to ask the committee that they don't use our Constitution to make a bluff. And I'd also like to conclude, Mr. Chairman, by saying that if you look at the facts, there are, as you Googled there, a few examples where people have camped out and grown roots in Congress, no questions. But the average span in both houses for members of Congress to serve is somewhere between typically 6 to 8 years. And it goes back and forth. You can't limit it. Term limits don't work. This is us blocking out the sun for what the founders told us to do, how to constrain our government. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee, for your attention. Happy to stand for your questions.
Thank you, Sean. Committee, any questions for either of our conferees? Senator Holscher first, and Senator Falscadeau.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Sure.
How about Sean? I think this is.
Mr. Chairman, I thought I heard my name, but I'm not hearing the question.
Sorry, I didn't have.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, she didn't have her mic on. Here we go,
Yes,
Sean.
I'm sorry about that. I'm going to direct my question to you, Sean.
Thank you, ma'am.
I was saying, I think this is my third hearing on this topic, and consistently we've been told by proponents that a convention can be limited. However, legal scholars and opponents tell us that that is not correct. What do you make of that, and can you share a little bit of information in that regard?
Well, I think that there's a lot of good Americans that want to save our country on the left and the right, and I'm not going to try to impute motive, but I will say there is a group that advocates for a convention that says the 1787 convention, which is our primary example, they say it was not a runaway. They talk about, if you look at the delegate commissions, which were the authority tickets given to the delegates to that convention, they say that they had all authority to address anything needed. And in fact, if you look at the commissions of 11 of the 12 states that went, and you can look at the University of Wisconsin Center for the Constitution, you can Google it, and those original documents are right there. They said they provided for the exigencies. The lawyers in the room will tell you that that is a word that essentially means the urgent needs of the time. And that is in fact true. But what they always omit is if you read further down, all of those delegate commissions incorporated by legal reference or specifically that any proposal that came before the 1787 convention had to be ratified by a vote of the Continental Congress and the state legislature of every single one of the 13 states of the time. And even Rhode Island, that did not attend the 1787 convention, sent the same language. Those of us that know our pocket constitution know that that absolutely was clearly disobeyed, and this cannot be debated. Article 7 of our constitution says it only required 9, not 13, to be implemented. Now, some will go on and say, well, they hate the Constitution, or see what he's saying, it's an illegitimate document. That is a straw man. Federalist 49 is very clear that the people, and all of us in basic high school, civics, we learn this, the people are the fountain of all power. So it was ratification conventions in the states and votes of the people that ratified. So we have a legitimate, valid, blessed constitution, I believe. But you had a convention where the delegates were clearly limited and they clearly exceeded their power. That is a precedent. It can happen again. And there actually have been other conventions in the history of our country that have been documented that also exceeded their authority. And the 1873 state convention in Pennsylvania is unique because it also shows how the court was asked to address it. The court said it had moved too far along in the ratification process so that it was moot and unauthorized changes to the Constitution were ratified.
Thank you, and thank you for your military service.
Thank you, ma'am.
Senator Falsgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the same question for the proponent, the gentleman on the right in the audience, John.
John
Yeah.
Axtell.
Yeah.
John, okay.
So, and then I guess is he a proponent?
No,
He's an
John's
opponent.
opponent,
But
yes.
I want to ask the proponent and the opponent the same question. So, to your point of the institution part of it, so lawmakers come and go, but staff and lobbyists stay. And a lot of times we have to hear from them on information that we vote on. And I always tell them that they have to tell me the pros and the cons. So, local government, like my Wichita City Council, they are term limited. What if this passes? The major detriment do you see?
Madison stated, I believe in the quote that well, thank you. Yeah. I think most people would like me to be muted or mooted, but that's okay. Thank you for your question, Senator. James Madison stated, and I'm going to paraphrase this in an essential way. Essentially, he said that the problem we face if we use term limits, he did not use that term in his quote, but the problem we face if we don't have much experience is that problem itself, the fact that people without experience are in this situation with lobbyists and so on, and they don't know how to face it in an experienced way. And it's that dearth of experience, that lack of experience, that presents more pitfalls than actually these people that have been around way, way too long. We know how to get rid of the people that have been around way too long, but there is no correction for a lack of experience that we, the people, can impose on those elected officials in a way that fixes it. We're just stuck with that lack of experience. And yes, we have to hold those people accountable in whether they're new or old. So that situation is the same. We the people, we as their constituents must Oh, closer? Okay, we must hold our elected officials accountable in either case, whether they've been around too long or they're brand new.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, is there a proponent that could,
Well, we had Shannon, I had closed the questions on the proponent oral, but if Shannon's there and has a very quick rebuttal, I don't know, she was on WebEx, I don't know if she's logged off or not.
I'm here, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, very quick rebuttal.
Yes, I would say that collectively, we have over 5,000 years of institutional knowledge in DC right now when you consider the time served by all of the people there and staff members and all. I would like to ask how that's going for us. Rhetorical question, obviously. And as far as experience is concerned, our framers intended a citizen legislature, not a careerism. And that is where we are at right now. The staff and the bureaucracy already run the show. I don't believe that we could make that any worse. And I believe that a term limited legislature goes in knowing that they have a limited time to leave a legacy and have to go back and live under what they've created. And they are more apt to make that change. The ones that are there right now could make changes that would limit the bureaucracy and the control of the staff, yet they choose not to because they dial for dollars instead of legislating and doing and representing the will of the people. I believe that term limits would definitely be a step in the right direction and help with that. I don't believe it's the silver bullet to fix everything, but it's a step in the right direction to begin getting things to move in Congress the way that they should.
Thank you, Shanna. Any other questions for our opponents? Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Little bit of history lesson here today. The original drafters of the Constitution did not put term limits in, and it came about because George Washington was the first president, of course, and he declined to run after 2 years, saying that 2 years was long enough for any president. Obviously wise beyond his years, and it wasn't until 1951 that the 22nd Amendment was ratified that put those term limits on presidents. But in all of those years, we did not have more. The only president who served more than 2 terms was Franklin Roosevelt, and he died just after his 4th term. So the founders of the Constitution didn't put this in there, but we did have individuals in history, obviously, that were a major part of creating our government that recognized that it's very important to not create kings and dictators in our government. So I fully support this. I think it's a great bill, and it's a way to further society. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Senator Holscher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was a bill introduced earlier in session that would designate the members of the Kansas Senate as delegates to a convention of states. How does that work potentially with something like this?
Is that to either John or Sean?
Yeah, maybe Sean. I don't
Okay.
know if that's something he could answer.
If Sean's still on?
And,
Thank
he
you,
may not
ma'am,
be
for the
familiar, so.
question.
He may not be.
I actually was just in the hearing on that bill or in your other side of your legislature this morning. And I think there's quite a bit of thoughtfulness there as to how your state or your legislature would pick who the delegates are going to be. Again, they put certain theorized limits in there that simply do not work and do not apply. I'd like to ask you to be mindful that last month, a couple of your legislators filed a lawsuit regarding this 2/3 thing you have in your state constitution that was put in by initiative in the 1970s by your people. They wanted that restriction in there, but there is quite a few legal references actually that may not apply because a state may not restrict something that is entirely originated as a federal function. If that's true, and I believe it actually will be true, that the The references, Dyer v. Blair and then Justice Story from the early days of the country support that in the Thornton v. Term Limits case. All these wishes and desires of who can recall, who can communicate with delegates, what can be controlled at a convention, what you may or may not participate in, all of those are great analytical thoughts. They're completely irrelevant, don't apply, and are unenforceable. And in 1973, the U.S. Senate unanimously passed a Constitutional Convention bill or Article 5 Convention bill that they define how all of this works. And one of the things was basically them codifying in law what's called the Free Speech and Debate Clause of the U.S. Constitution that allows those officials to basically say, do, vote, whatever they want and not be held accountable by any legal body outside of the convention. And I think all this is going to do is create a lot of confusion and litigation. And to the other representative's point, I believe she's historically correct as far as term limits, but I would caution that term limits on a president absolutely can prevent a king, and I think that was a great amendment. We're talking about 535 members of Congress. There's a lot of diversity, debate, and discussion there. And the part that got left out is the founders decided not to put term limits in our Constitution at the 1787 convention. But the Constitution prior to that, which was the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, did have term limits. They saw it on practice, debated it, and consciously chose to move away from them and not include them as to the members of the Congress. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, both proponents and opponents. We will close the hearing on SCR 1609. I don't have any other work for us today. We have no meeting tomorrow. Monday, we do anticipate working 2 bills. Just heads up on 474 and 254 for Monday. And that's all we have on for today. Thank you, committee, for your work, and we are adjourned.